past few weeks, I've noticed a few comments here and there asking me what I think about a new COVID vaccine study that suggests that vaccines aren't safe. And it was weird because I tend to generally be aware of research in that area. Not that I see everything as soon as it's published, but if something is on enough people's radar that they're leaving comments about it, usually I'm aware of it. But in this case, there were several people talking about a new study on COVID vaccines, and I had not heard anything about it. So what was going on? I had to look into this. And eventually I figured it out. The reason why I hadn't heard of it is because there is no study. There isn't. There's the ghost of a whisper of a study that might have been. And because our mainstream media outlets have spent the past decade or more destroying their science reporting departments, they're reporting on the ghost of a whisper of a study as if it's a real study. And from there, the far-right anti-science, anti-vaccination brigade has spread the good news. Science says vaccines are bad, actually. Scientists find clues on why COVID vaccine causes chronic health problems in some, says Fox News. Scientists describe rare syndrome following COVID vaccinations, reports the New York Times. Some people have rare reactions to the COVID vaccine, and researchers want to know why, explains People magazine. Sorry, People magazine, isn't that the magazine for pictures of the new bachelor and royal family babies? Like, what the fuck? Okay, so what's the story here? Well, it's like it's mid-2020 all over again, because apparently we're all deciding to talk seriously about a preprint. Preprints are papers that an author puts online before it's accepted by a journal and goes through peer review. There's not necessarily anything wrong with publishing preprints. In fact, posting a study in full online can actually allow for a more thorough peer review. Instead of a journal handing a paper to a select few people to examine, a broad spectrum of experts can read it, dissect it, compare notes, and improve the final product. But it's always important to remember that the preprint itself does not necessarily include any of that criticism, and you absolutely must always keep in mind that a preprint might just be made up out of whole cloth. That's why it's absolutely fine to discuss preprints amongst people who understand what a preprint is, but it's completely immoral for a mainstream news organization to report on the findings of a preprint for a mainstream audience and not mention that it hasn't been published anywhere until the third paragraph, and then to not even mention the lack of peer review at all. With that in mind, let's look at what the actual preprint says. It's titled Immunological and Antigenic Signatures Associated with Chronic Illnesses After COVID-19 Vaccination. And accordingly, it examines the people who say that they are suffering from an array of various symptoms that have lingered long after they were vaccinated against COVID-19. In addition to being a preprint, the authors make it clear that this is just a preliminary study. That means that we shouldn't expect to see large sample sizes or strong and specific hypotheses and conclusions. Preliminary studies tend to be smaller, to find weaker effects, or explore a wider array of data because the point is to provide, a jumping off point for future researchers to dig into. In this case, the researchers were hoping to encourage more study of what they call post-vaccination syndrome, which encompasses a lot of symptoms, but by and large tends to resemble long COVID. Exercise intolerance, excessive fatigue, numbness, brain fog, neuropathy, insomnia, palpitations, myalgia, tinnitus, or humming in ears, headache, burning sensations, and dizziness. It wouldn't be completely shocking to discover that a small percentage of people would suffer from some of those effects after any vaccine. Vaccines interact with and stimulate our immune system. And so, of course, there's a chance for a negative event. It's relatively common to feel a bit run down after getting vaccinated or to have soreness at the point of injection. And in very rare cases, vaccines can trigger serious reactions like seizures or severe allergic reactions. And those can sometimes lead to death. those reactions are so rare that it's actually way safer to get vaccines that have been approved than it is to risk getting the disease that the vaccine helps prevent. The reports of this long COVID type reaction after the COVID vaccine are also exceedingly rare, but they exist. And so it's important for researchers to study them and to help those people. So the authors of this preliminary preprint gathered 42 people who said that they have post-vaccination syndrome and compared them to a control group of 22 healthy people. They conducted a single blood draw on each subject, and they found certain immune differences between the two groups. Still following? Just to recap, it's a preprint. It's a preliminary study of only 42 people who self-reported their vaccine history and their symptoms, and it found some differences between the immune system of those people compared to people who self-reported that they are healthy after a single blood draw. It's already quite obviously not headline news, but it turns out that once we apply a little bit of peer review, even the small amount of data that's there completely falls apart. Now, I am not a peer to these researchers. I am wholly unqualified to review their data. So instead, I'm going to refer you to Dr. Dan Wilson, a molecular biologist with a delightful channel here on YouTube called Debunk the Funk. I highly recommend you give him a follow, check out his Patreon if this topic interests you, and also click through to watch his entire video. As always, links to everything are found in the transcript, linked below in the description box at patreon.com/Rebecca or skepchick.org. But before you go and watch his whole video, or if you choose not to, let me just recap some of the things he says. Dr. Wilson points out that this study is so poorly designed that it doesn't even do its main job as a preliminary hypothesis generator. One of the big things that I completely missed is that these researchers said that they took efforts to make sure that these people weren't just suffering long COVID, because, all of their symptoms sound like long COVID that you get from just catching COVID. But the test they used to determine whether or not the group actually had COVID at some point was flawed to the point that even they admit one person from each group tested negative for previous infection, despite reporting that they had, in fact, had a previous infection. So there's no way to know whether these people who are reporting identical symptoms to long COVID are actually just suffering regular old long COVID. Wilson goes on to point out that the researchers chose a terrible test for finding exhausted T cells, and they further screwed up the method of trying to detect Epstein-Barr, which is what causes mono and may be to blame for some of these symptoms being reported. Turns out, to detect that, you need to have a baseline, so you can't just figure it out from a single blood draw. Again, I'll recommend go watch his entire video to learn more about the various problems with this paper. But I'll just conclude by attempting to answer a question Dr. Wilson brings up.
Also, an easier way to directly gauge if Epstein-Barr virus is reactivating is just to test for its DNA in the patient's blood. If it's reactivating and then deactivating, you'll see these levels of DNA go up and down. But they don't do that here, and it would be really easy to do, so I'm not sure why they didn't.
When there are obviously better, more effective ways to gather and examine the data these researchers were looking for, why did they choose the sloppier methods? He mentions that one of the authors, David Petrino, has been on social media pushing supplements to protect anti-vaxxers from people who are shedding the vaccine in their presence, which is obviously all bullshit and a huge red flag. But I would like to add, by just, pointing out some fun facts about two of the other authors. Denise Hertz and Brianne Dressen are part of an organization called React 19, which, according to their website, provides science-based support for people suffering from long-term COVID-19 vaccine effects. The effects that we don't even know exist yet, and which this study was supposedly going to find preliminary evidence for. Don't forget to swing by their merch shop and pick up a t-shirt that says long vax because, yeah, they've already coined all the lingo. Helen Branswell of Stat noticed that at some point after it was published, the preprint was updated to include that information in the Declaration of Interest, along with the news that Dressen additionally reports being a plaintiff in a lawsuit against AstraZeneca, alleging breach of contract following her volunteer participation in 2020 in their COVID-19 vaccine clinical trial. So yeah, I have an idea of why these serious researchers failed to adequately present any decent data for their study, because they're infected with anti-vaccine hysteria. And instead of doing the absolute most basic fact-checking on this, outlets like the New York Times and People magazine, of all places, have run to pile onto the anti-science paranoia that is literally killing people as I speak. People, children, are dying of vaccine-preventable illnesses because of exactly this shit. Don't fall for it. Hey everybody, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. If you loved the video, please subscribe. And if you think the world could use more videos like this and you happen to have a few bucks laying around, head to patreon.com/Rebecca and join an awesome community of nerds like the people whose names you see on the screen right now. Thanks.